today. The IFS saying that the Conservatives, Labour, Lib Dems and the SNP have failed to provide, and this is the quote, anything like full details on plans to cut the deficit, leaving the electorate in the dark. That's the language they use. Let's get some reaction to that from the Conservative Treasurer, Mr David Gauke. Mr Gauke, a very good morning to you.
Good morning.
You've left the voters in the dark.
Well, what I would say is judge us on our track record. Over the last 5 years, we've halved, in fact, we've more than halved the deficit as a proportion of the economy. We've increased expenditure on the NHS. We've increased the personal allowance, lifting millions out of income tax. That's what we've done in the very difficult circumstances that we faced over the last 5 years, and that's what we'll continue to do over the course of the next 5 years were we to be elected.
But you're talking about it in the most general terms, aren't you? I mean, we've got Carl Emerson here from the Institute for Fiscal Studies saying that your plans to cut the deficit, and I'll quote it precisely, predicated on substantial and almost entirely unspecified spending cuts and tax increases. Almost entirely unspecified spending cuts and tax increases. I mean, you're a government that's going into this on its economic record, but you're not specifying where the tax cuts are coming from. I should say the tax increases and spending cuts are coming from.
Well, what we've said on tax increases, we're talking about tax evasion, tax avoidance, aggressive tax planning.
Everybody agrees on that, don't they? Everybody says that.
Yeah, and over the course of the last Parliament, we found £7 billion from those sources. What we're saying is that over the next Parliament, we'll find £5 billion. When it comes to departmental spending, what we're doing is essentially continuing the same rate of reduction for unprotected government departments as we've seen.
But you won't say where that 30 billion is going to fall.
Well, we've said with the 30 billion is that there'll be 13 billion from departmental spending, so that's a reduction along the lines of the similar rate to what we've done over the course of this Parliament. 12 billion from welfare changes,
which you won't break down.
And we found 21 billion.
12 billion of welfare cuts, which you won't break down for us.
Well, what we've done over the course of this Parliament is identify 21 billion pounds worth of savings from policy changes. What we're saying is we can find a further 12 billion.
You're saying to the electorate, trust us because we won't give you the details.
Well, look at our track record. We've delivered the welfare changes. We've delivered the tax avoidance and tax evasion measures. We've delivered departmental spending reductions while seeing more children attending good and outstanding schools. We find more support for the NHS. Yeah. Crime has fallen by a quarter over the course of this Parliament.
You said you mentioned the NHS. You're quite happy to make very specific pledges on spending, an extra £8 billion to the NHS, but not on the cuts, and that's what people find paradoxical.
Well, with the NHS, we have a plan set out by Simon Stevens, who's the Chief Executive of NHS England. He says that we need to find another £8 billion to deliver that plan. We believe it has to be a priority, and we have to find that £8 billion. And as I say, I speak as a part of a government that's found £7.3 billion in real terms over the course of the last Parliament. But let me just also make one other point about what the IFS has said, which is they've said that at the end of the Parliament, if you compare our plans with what the Labour Party and the SNP are setting out, they would increase debt by £90 billion. And that's £5,000 for every working household in the country. And that's a real risk for the economy, and that's something that I think the British people need to be aware of, because we do face the prospect of higher levels of debt, and everyone will have to pay for that, from both the Labour Party and, by the way, the SNP have very similar plans.
Do you recognise this IFS figure that you're planning the largest reduction of all the parties in borrowing, 5.2% of national income? Does that tally with Treasury figures?
Well, the largest reduction in borrowing, yes. So the other parties would borrow more than we would, and so yes, we would reduce borrowing more over the course of the next Parliament than the other parties would do. We believe that is the prudent thing to do, and if we don't reduce borrowing, then, as I say, you are left with higher levels of debt, and as I say, £5,000 worth of debt for every working household in the country is a very large sum indeed, and that is what the IFS have said today a Labour government for the next 5 years would leave you with.
And where do you feel about this, in terms of this, the idea of organisations like the IFS in particular, road testing party policies? I mean, it represents something new under the sun of canvassing, campaigning, the whole election process, doesn't it? Is it something voters ought to welcome, this idea that, we can look at your figures, your projections, with a forensic eye through the IFS? Does that help us?
The IFS have a valuable role in these debates. Don't always agree with everything that the IFS says, but they add to an informed debate in this area, and in particular the numbers that they've set out today, setting out how debt at the end of this, the next Parliament will be much higher under a Labour government, or particularly if it's backed by the SNP, compared to a Conservative government, is certainly something I think the voters should take account of.
David Gauke, thanks for your time.